It was a dusty evening in Kaya, a small town in Burkina Faso. Fatimata, a mother of four, stood behind her millet stall, waiting for the last few customers. Her husband, once a proud teacher in Bobo Dioulasso, had long traded chalk for a hoe, farming to keep food on the table. But that day, something paused their routine. It wasn't an order. It wasn't news of war. It was a voice, Ibrahim Traoré. He wasn't delivering slogans. He wasn't pleading with donors. He was declaring truth. His words, sharp and steady, cut through decades of silence. He spoke not of begging, but of building, not of waiting, but of walking forward alone if necessary. He said plainly, if we stay weak, we will be broken. Fatimata turned to her husband and asked, did he just say we could win without them? He nodded. But the look in his eyes was not certainty, it was hope, mixed with fear, because the road Traoré described was not easy. But what if it was righteous? Could a poor, landlocked nation teach the continent how to stand again like David before Goliath? And what if the empire's greatest fear wasn't guns or oil, but something deeper, the awakening of a people once silenced? But what exactly did Traoré say that shook both Paris and Washington at a solemn ceremony in Russia, commemorating the 80th anniversary of victory over Nazism? Ibrahim Traoré took the stage not as a guest, but as a student of history. The world expected polite diplomacy. Instead, Traoré offered a manifesto. He spoke clearly, deliberately, and without apology. He drew a direct line between Africa's present struggle and Russia's past survival. He reminded the audience how Russia, battered by sanctions and political isolation, didn't crumble. It adapted, it localized its industries, hardened its currency, and turned global rejection into a blueprint for autonomy. And then he turned to Africa. Why, he asked, does Africa always wait for help? Why do we collapse under sanctions, accept conditional loans, reduce our ambitions, and beg for support with more strings than solutions? He was not romanticizing Moscow or glorifying the East. No. Traoré's message was methodical. Study how a nation survives without approval. It wasn't about military mimicry or Cold War nostalgia. It was about something more sacred, self-sufficiency. He told the truth many African leaders fear to whisper. The West doesn't negotiate with dependency. It exploits it. And a nation that cannot survive without its former colonizers is still in chains. He quoted no scriptures. But his tone echoed prophecy. This wasn't about Burkina Faso alone. This was the beginning of a doctrine Africa must build leverage before it can bargain. Just like a man must first till the soil before he prays for rain. What Russia did under fire, Traoré argued, was something African nations had yet to attempt resist without retreat. From Mali to Niger, from Guinea to Chad, the pattern of collapse under pressure was common. But what if, just once, a nation refused to fall? He called it detox. A brutal, necessary withdrawal from systems designed to keep Africa in waiting rooms, waiting for aid, waiting for approval, waiting for rescue. And he said plainly, this is the starting point, not the end. Once you reject the empire, you must build what it won't give you. His voice didn't shake, but behind his words was the weight of generations farmers who worked without tools, teachers who spoke without chalk, soldiers who marched with borrowed rifles, and he warned independence means nothing without endurance. But why did Traoré speak next about laboratories and chemistry, instead of only politics or weapons? The moment Traoré began speaking of laboratories, something shifted. He told a story, one that many missed. As a boy, he memorized the periodic table. His classmates nicknamed each other after scientists, laughing at formulas they didn't fully grasp. We were very good on paper, he said, but we lacked the labs to make it real. That wasn't a joke. It was an indictment. He wasn't just talking about chemistry. He was revealing a sickness. Africa teaches obedience, not creation. It produces graduates, fluent in theory but unable to act. When crisis comes, they don't mobilize knowledge, they dial Geneva. He pointed out that Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger grow cotton, but they can't produce gunpowder. Why? Because no one taught them how to turn that cotton into cellulose. And that cellulose into defense? Russia can build missiles because it builds chemistry. It was a brutal metaphor. Africa can quote its freedom but cannot defend it. And Traore was done quoting. That day, Fatimata's husband turned off the radio and whispered, "We are educated, but not free." He wasn't angry. He was ashamed. For years, he taught his students that knowledge was power. Now he saw power requires tools, but Traore went further. He spoke of Africa's schools. Yes, but also of its absence of political laboratories, no space to test Pan-African trade, no room for alternative governance, no protected zones to experiment with self-reliance. Why? Because every African idea is filtered through donors, consultants, or foreign advisors before it ever touches African soil. The message was unmistakable. Africa cannot rise by theory alone. And that's when Traore reached deep into the wound of history. He said plainly, when France tested its first nuclear bomb, they placed black soldiers in the blast zone to study the effects. It's in the archives. A truth so monstrous, it barely sounds real. But it was real. And it hasn't been atoned for. That's why this wasn't a political speech. It was a call for justice. Not revenge, not hate, but the justice that Christ himself taught. Truth first, then healing, because you cannot build dignity on top of denial. You cannot resurrect a people if their story is buried. Traore's calm became thunder. We need places to practice, places to build, and no more permission slips from Paris. And what if Christ never asked for permission before turning over the tables in the temple? What if righteousness begins when we stop asking and start building? But what happens when the world sees Africa finally say no and mean it? Fatimata no longer waits for headlines. She watches the road, and what she sees is change slow but real. Since Burkina Faso expelled French troops and declined Western aid, many expected collapse, yet markets reopened. Militias were pushed back. Small farms like hers began to trade directly with neighbors in Mali and Niger, bypassing old colonial routes. But with independence comes cost. Fuel prices rose. Medicines became scarce. Her children's school now teaches fewer hours because foreign funding vanished. But her husband tells her, this is how healing begins when the body rejects the poison. The village pastor echoed him in last Sunday's sermon. Faith without trial is not faith at all. God delivered Israel after the wilderness, not before it. Traore knew this too. He warned that strength would bring isolation, that the West would brand Burkina Faso as unstable, militant, authoritarian. And indeed, international media moved fast. Headlines labeled him a strongman, his reforms risky, his ideas dangerous. But the people weren't afraid because for the first time in decades, someone was speaking directly to them, not over them. Schools began adapting. Teachers, once demoralized, started reworking lessons to include Burkina's own history, not just French literature and European maps. Community groups formed to share medicine and food locally. Without waiting for shipments from Europe, the old system relied on waiting. This new one relies on doing. In the next 3 to 6 months, the cracks will deepen or new foundations will emerge. If regional cooperation strengthens, we could see a new model of localized economies, regional defense, and curriculum reform. But if pressure mounts and elites in hiding try to undermine it, there's a risk of internal sabotage fueled by external money. Still, Fatimata's husband smiles when he sees his daughter write an essay titled, "Why We Don't Wait Anymore." But how does the rest of the world, especially the United States, interpret this quiet revolution, and what will they do next? Almost immediately after Burkina Faso's pivot, Western media shifted tone. Once considered a quiet partner in counterterrorism, it was now painted as a threat. Reports used familiar phrases: military rule, instability, anti-Western rhetoric. The French president warned of Russian influence on young Africans. U.S. officials questioned Traoré's intentions. The EU froze aid. But none of this was surprising. Because what the West fears most isn't a war, it's a working alternative. If Burkina Faso proves that a landlocked, poor, aid-rejecting country can survive and thrive, it becomes a symbol, and symbols spread. Washington has seen this before in Cuba, where sanctions failed to topple Castro, in Vietnam, where bombs didn't kill resolve, in Iran, where decades of pressure didn't erase resistance. The common thread: nations that stopped asking for permission. But Burkina Faso's case is more fragile and more dangerous to the status quo. It is in Africa. It speaks French. It's historically dependent, and now it's breaking the pattern. For U.S. foreign policy, this is a dilemma. Support democracy, then why criticize a leader with massive grassroots support? Push sanctions, then risk pushing Burkina deeper into Russia or China's arms. Stay silent, then watch a new model spread across the Sahel. If America recalibrates choosing respectful engagement over coercion, it could shape a new partnership with emerging African leadership. But if it clings to control, the backlash will be long, quiet, and irreversible. And as the world watches Traoré, one question remains: is he an outlier or the first of many? The world is not gentle with the weak. That's not cynicism, it's scripture. The lion does not spare the lamb, unless the shepherd intervenes. And in global politics, no shepherd is coming. Burkina Faso has chosen to walk alone through valleys, shadowed by isolation, through headlines sharpened like spears, through markets closed and treaties torn. But perhaps that's the cost of dignity. Traoré never promised miracles. He spoke of endurance, of work, of laboratories where African hands would learn to fail on their own terms until success was theirs. It's not glamorous. It's not fast. But neither was the cross. When Christ carried his cross, no empire applauded. When he rose, no empire surrendered it. But the world changed. Quietly, irreversibly. Burkina Faso is not a perfect nation. It stumbles. It bleeds. It grieves. But what if that's exactly why its stand matters? What if the path to justice does not begin with riches or armies, but with the decision to stop bowing? What if God is not asking Africa to wait any longer, but to walk? And what if the true power in this age is not held by those who control the cameras, but by those who refuse to be framed? So we ask you not to follow, but to reflect. If Christ returned today, would he find us waiting for help or building what we were given the wisdom to create? Ibrahim Traoré is not just a soldier or a statesman. He is a mirror, and what you see in him depends on what you believe about justice, faith, and what it means to be free